The richest kind of wealth. Some stories come from imagination. This one comes from memory stitched together with love and a whole lot of creative grace. Well, the characters you'll meet here, Delilah, Rhett, Ron, are fictional. Their spirit is very real. Drawn from the early mornings I spent behind the counter in a small village cafe, pouring coffee for the regulars who showed up with muddy boots, wrinkled newspapers, and more wisdom than they ever claimed to have. One of them, a man named Ron, changed my life. Not with grand speeches and not with big promises, but with simple truths, steady encouragement, and the quiet belief that ordinary people living ordinary lives could build extraordinary futures, one small choice at a time. This is a story about that kind of change. Slow, unflashy, life-altering. It's about the kind of wealth that can't be measured in bank accounts alone, the kind that grows in love, honesty, resilience, and the willingness to dream out loud again after life has tried to silence you. I hope as you listen in, you find a little bit of yourself here, and maybe, just maybe, a little bit of hope for what's still possible, no matter where you are starting from. Welcome to The Richest Kind of Wealth. The morning shift. The door chimed in that familiar way, a soft jangle that meant that 5:45 a.m., another Monday, another coffee to pour. Delilah tightened the apron around her waist and wiped her hands on a clean cloth, already warming into the rhythm of the morning. Ron, Lou, and Dan shuffled in, boots heavy with a damp spring air like clockwork. They always joked that they didn't need watches. The smell of the burnt toast and strong coffee was all the alarm they needed. She smiled as she handed Ron his usual, 2 creams, 1 sugar, double wink. If I ever had a granddaughter, Ron said, accepting the cup with a playful flourish, I'd want her to be just like you. Smart, steady, and stubborn enough to survive in this crazy world. Delilah laughed, tucking a stray curl behind her ear. Compliments like that still sat strangely on her, like a coat she wasn't sure she was allowed to wear. The truth was, life had never taught her to expect much. Raised in a storm, survival had been her only education. Even now married to Rhett, blessed with 2 beautiful daughters, a home patched together with love and duct tape, she lived month to month, never more than a car repair or a sick kid away from the edge. And yet here, in the sleepy hum of the cafe, something was quietly changing. It started with small things like the way Ron talked about money, like it was a tool instead of a ticking bomb. Stocks, bonds, dividends, words that sounded like they belonged to people who wore suits and had 2-car garages were now spilling across the counter with the same ease as jokes about the weather. One morning, wiping down the coffee pots, Delilah found herself asking, "What's the difference between a stock and a bond anyway?" Ron looked up from his newspaper, the hint of a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Well now," he said, holding the paper neatly, "that's a better question than you know." He reached for the salt and pepper shakers, pulling them onto the counter like chess pieces. And just like that, her second great education began. Not in a classroom, not with textbooks, but in the quiet clink of spoons, the low murmur of old friends, and the slow, steady heartbeat of a woman learning, maybe for the first time, that the future wasn't something to fear. It was something she could build, one step at a time. The first lesson. The next morning, Ron slid a small, slightly crumpled notebook across the counter toward Delilah. It had a dollar store sticker still half peeled off on the back, and carefully hand-printed words across the cover. Delilah's Budget, Step 1. Inside, ruled columns were drawn with a ruler. Expenses on page 1, income on the next. No formula, no lectures, just a place to see it. Delilah blinked down at it, her hands still warm from wiping the coffee pots. "You want me to," she hesitated. "Fill it out," Ron said gently. "Every penny you spend, every penny you earned, for a full month." He leaned back, letting his chair creak under his weight, hands folded over his worn flannel shirt. There were still smudges of barn dust on his pants where the cats had tackled him that morning, but Ron didn't seem to notice or mind. "I thought you were going to show me how to invest," Delilah said, trying to half joke and half deflect. "This is investing," Ron said with a wink. "Before you plant seeds, you gotta know what kind of dirt you're working with." She didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Budget? They were lucky if they made it to payday without putting groceries on the Visa. Still, something in Ron's voice, steady, sure, no judgment, cracked through the wall of shame she didn't even know she still carried. He wasn't here to scold her, and he wasn't here to save her. He was here to teach her if she was willing to learn. Delilah tucked the notebook under her arm like a secret. She spent the rest of her shift refilling coffees, taking orders, smiling, but her mind kept drifting back to the small, crinkled pages tucked against her chest. Maybe, just maybe, this could be different. Maybe this was the beginning of something better. Not for someday, but for right now. Facing the numbers. That night, after the girls were tucked in bed and Rhett had gone out to the garage to tinker with the heater again, Delilah sat at the kitchen table. The little dollar store notebook sat in front of her, half hopeful, half terrifying. A cheap blue pen rolled back and forth with the slight slope of the table. She drew a long, slow breath and opened it. Expenses first. Groceries, gas, hydro, cell phones, mortgage, insurance, ballet lessons, the random trips to Dollarama that were never as cheap as she told herself they were. Rhett's work boots, birthday gifts, the late night I'm too tired to cook pizzas. It felt endless and heavy, like stacking bricks against her own chest. When she flipped to the income side and added up their paychecks, Rhett's steady, modest wage, and her tiny shifts at the cafe, she felt her stomach drop. How have we even survived this long? Her first instinct was to slam the notebook shut, shove it in a drawer, and pretend she hadn't seen any of it. Instead, she stared at it hard, like trying to read a map that only showed dead ends. It wasn't fair. It wasn't her fault she hadn't been taught these things. It wasn't her fault her childhood was spent surviving, not learning. And yet, a small voice whispered, "It's still yours to fix now." Somewhere deep inside, maybe in the parts Rhett and Ron had been watering all those years, she found enough courage to pick up the pen again. She circled the biggest expenses. She put question marks beside the ones that she wasn't sure about. She even made a tiny star beside a couple, like the streaming subscriptions she could cancel tomorrow if she wanted. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't pretty, but it was a start. Another lesson the next morning. The cafe smelled like burnt toast and rain when Ron shuffled in, the cat's love still evident in the smudges on his pants. He noticed the tight set of Delilah's jaw before she even spoke. "Tough night?" he asked, accepting his coffee. She slid the notebook across the counter. "Budgeting sucks," she said flatly. Ron chuckled, not at her, but with a kind of warm understanding that made her shoulders drop a little. "It does," he agreed easily. "The first time you see it all laid out feels like someone took the air out of the room." She nodded mutely, her fingers fiddling with a stir stick. "But," he said, stirring his coffee, "you can't fix what you can't see." He pulled a battered business card from his wallet, and on the back, written in neat block letters, was a short phrase. "The numbers aren't personal, they're just information." Ron tapped the card against the counter. "You're not a bad person because you're broke sometimes, and you're not broken because money's tight. It's just numbers. It's just a starting point." Delilah swallowed against the lump rising in her throat. No one had ever said it like that before. "So," Ron said, eyes twinkling, "ready for the next part?" She wasn't sure if she was. Yet somehow she found herself nodding anyway. Step 1, rein it in. Ron pushed his coffee cup aside and pulled Delilah's notebook toward him like it was a project they were both working on together. "No judgment," he said, firm but kind, "only forward." He flipped to the first page and nodded. "Please, you did a good job, kiddo. You looked at it. Most people never get this far." Delilah fiddled with the edge of her apron. It's embarrassing," she admitted. "We make so many mistakes. credit cards, payday loans, once when the truck broke down, and stuff we didn't even think about. Ron smiled softly like he'd heard this story 1,000 times. You weren't taught, he said simply. Neither was Rhett by the sounds of it. In some family, money is a dirty word, and in others it's just invisible. Either way, it leaves you flying blind. Delilah felt tears prick at the back of her eyes, but she blinked them away. This wasn't about shame anymore. This was about change. So what now? She asked, her voice smaller than she meant it to be. Now, Ron said, pulling a pen from his jacket, we rein it in. He wrote 3 words at the top of a fresh page. Know, own, and plan. First, he said, tapping know. You have to know exactly what's coming in and what's going out. No guessing, no writing down, about this much. It's exact numbers monthly. Second, tapping own. You face it. No blaming, no hiding, no wishing it was different. Just own where you're standing, good or bad. And third, tapping plan. You make a plan that feels like breathing, not a punishment. Not like squeezing blood from a stone, something you can actually live with. Delilah leaned over the counter, absorbing every word like it was sunlight. How do we start? She said. Ron grilled, pulling out a napkin and sketching 3 simple circles. Needs: roof, food, lights, gas. Wants: the little extras, dinner out, new clothes, TV subscriptions. Future: savings, debt payments, and dreams. Every dollar you get, he said, you should know where it's going even before it hits your hand. He sat back and let that sink in. And Delilah, he added quietly, money's not just about paying bills. It's about buying your dreams. She looked up startled. Dreams? When you're always scared about money, Ron said, you stop dreaming. You don't even realize you're doing it. You shove the idea of a better car, a vacation, even another baby into a little closet marked someday. He pointed his pen right at her heart. But dreams need light, just like seeds. If you never talk about them, never plan for them, they never grow. Delilah felt something crack wide open inside her. Maybe for the first time in her life, she realized money just wasn't about fear. It could be about hope, and hope was worth fighting for. Cracks and courage. She didn't tell Rhett at first. It was too new and too fragile, like seedlings you had to keep under the soil just for a little while before letting the sun hit it. Instead, Delilah started dropping little hints, comments about grocery sales, a casual mention that it might be nice to see exactly where their money was going. At first, Rhett just gruntled in response, distracted by a hockey game or fixing the leaky sink. But one night, after a long day at work, after paying a bigger than expected hydro bill, Delilah tried to really bring it up. Maybe we should make a budget, she said gently, sliding 2 mugs of tea onto the kitchen table between them. Just to see, like no pressure. The air went cold. Rhett stiffened, his hands closing into slow, frustrated fists. What, do you think I don't know how to run this house? He snapped. You think if I made more money, everything would be fine? Delilah tried to soften it, tried to reach him. No, Rhett, it's just... And what about Caleb, huh? His voice cracked. We had saving once, spent it burying our son. The words landed like a slap, a deep old ache Delilah had learned to carry without showing. She had almost folded, almost backed away like she had 100 times before. But this time, Ron's words echoed in her mind. It's just numbers. It's not personal unless you make it personal. She swallowed down the hurt and looked Rhett in the face. I'm not blaming you, she said, voice steady. I'm not blaming me either. I just want us to dream again. Rhett, I want us to feel like we're moving forward, not just patching holes. He said nothing, just stared at the table, his face a mess of anger and shame and sadness. After a few heavy minutes, he pushed his chair back roughly and went out to the garage, letting the door slam loudly behind him. Delilah sat there for a long time, the tea cooling between her hands. Tears welled, and she blinked them away. Maybe she had made a mistake trusting Ron with something so personal. Maybe some people were meant to survive and not thrive. The very next morning. The cafe was busy, the smell of fresh baked cinnamon buns curling through the air, the hum of low conversation filling the small space. Delilah worked the counter, refilling coffee, smiling automatically, her heart heavy. When Ron walked in, she passed on her best brave face, and when Rhett followed behind a few minutes later, joking with Lou and Dan about the local hockey scores, her heart gave a funny little stutter. She wiped a mug with a cloth and watched from the corner of her eye. There was Rhett leaning against the counter, laughing, teasing, bantering with the men who talked about money like it was just another thing, not a loaded gun. Lou grumbled about some mining stocks he should have sold 6 months ago. Dan joked that his investments were mostly in beer and bad bets these days. Ron chuckled and said he always preferred simple things, good companies held for years, left to do their own work quietly. It wasn't uptight and it wasn't shameful and it wasn't even at all serious. It was all normal and light. Delilah poured another coffee and smiled to herself, a slow dawning realization blooming in her chest. Maybe it's not that money is heavy. Maybe it's that we were taught to carry it the wrong way. Maybe, just maybe, it could be different. Not overnight, not perfectly, but different. And sometimes that was enough to start learning to sit with it. That Saturday, after the breakfast rush died down and the smell of bacon had finally faded from her hair, Delilah poured herself a coffee and slid onto the empty stool at the end of the cafe counter. She didn't say much, she just listened to Ron talking about the beauty of simple stocks, nothing fancy, nothing, just solid, boring companies that paid dividends like clockwork. To Lou grumbling about property taxes but smiling, as he did, knowing he had several rental units stashed away for retirement. To Dan laughing about the time he put money into some fad startup and lost half of it overnight. Good lesson, cheap price. And it wasn't the words so much, it was the way they talked. Like money wasn't a test that you were either smart enough or lucky enough to pass. It was just a tool, like a hammer, like a garden hoe, like anything you learn to hold properly. Rhett wandered in later, after finishing a job helping his buddy put up a fence. He raised an eyebrow when he saw Delilah perched there, coffee in hand, chatting and laughing with the guys like she'd always belonged. At first, he just stood awkwardly by the door, then Ron called out, "Grab a cup, Rhett. You're late to the board meeting." Everyone laughed, and something in Rhett's shoulders loosened. He slid onto the stool beside Delilah, accepting a refill from her with a muttered thanks. For the first time in a long time, they sat side by side, not talking about money yet, not pushing, just sharing space in this strange new world she had found. A crack of light. The girls were asleep. The house was quiet, except for the low creak of the wind easing against the window frames. Rhett sat at the kitchen table, his big hands wrapped around a chipped mug of tea, staring into the dark outside. Delilah thought about leaving him to his thoughts, not wanting to push again. Then he cleared his throat. If we were to... He stopped and then started, like the words had a strange taste. He rubbed his hand against the back of his neck. If we were to make a plan, he said finally, voice low, what would that even look like? Delilah set down the dish towel she'd been folding and moved slowly to sit across from him. Careful, gentle, no sudden movements. It wouldn't be scary, she said, smiling just a little. It would be simple, honest, nothing you couldn't handle. He let out a small, almost laugh, but not quite. And we wouldn't have to give up anything, he said, still weary. Not anything we weren't willing to give up. Just we can start naming our dreams again and make sure we're steering towards them, even if it's slow. For a long time, Rhett sat there staring into his mug. Then finally he looked up at her. I miss dreaming, he said quietly. I didn't even realize how much. And there it was. Not a full surrender, not a complete fix, just a crack of light a seed needs to start growing. Making room for dreams. The next Saturday, after the girls had been fed and laundered half finished, Delilah and Rhett sat down at the kitchen table again, this time with a paper and pens, and the real intention to do more than just talk. First step, clear the decks. They made a list of everything they were spending that wasn't necessary. Netflix gone. The village library had a whole wall of DVDs and free streaming they could access with their free card. Eating out, done. It would be homemade everything now, even if it was just a grilled cheese sandwich and soup for supper. Rhett's old second car, the one that gulped gas and insurance money like it was a second mortgage, sold within a week. Delilah's legs could carry her the slick 6 blocks to work easily, even on the cold mornings. And that one change alone saved hundreds off of their monthly bills, gas, insurance, and repairs. Even the way they managed family changed. Instead of giving Rhett's mom free rent out of guilt for all her help with the girls, they had an honest conversation. They agreed she'd paid a modest rent. They would pay her for her monthly childcare, receipts and all, everything above board. And it was awkward at first, but everyone walked away feeling respected, and it balanced the books the way good fences make good neighbors. Next step, bring more in. Delilah picked up a lunch shift at the cafe, 11:30 till 2:30, just enough to stack her mornings and still have weekends free with the girls. The lunch crowd was livelier and much tippier. She found herself laughing more, learning to hustle without burning out. With both shifts combined, her income almost doubled. Rhett, too, had a reckoning. At first it hurt, realizing loyalty to his own boss wasn't noble if it meant shortchanging his own family. But Ron's words rang in his ears. Your first responsibility is the people you go home to. He quietly applied to a few new companies. By the end of the month he had an offer. Better hours, better benefits, and better pay. For the first time since Caleb's funeral, they began living within margin. Tiny margin, a few $100s extra here and there, but it felt like breathing after years of drowning with just enough to survive. The first real win. Tax season rolled around faster than expected, with their lower income the previous year, plus childcare receipts, plus deductions they had never known how to claim before. Thanks to the library's free tax help night, they got a very large refund, more than they'd ever thought possible. They sat at the kitchen table staring at the check. It wasn't millions, it wasn't even tens of thousands, but it was enough to wipe out one credit card completely, gone, zero balance, and no interest sucking them dry anymore. Delilah laughed and cried at the same time when they mailed that payment. Rhett just stood there for a long time, the receipt in his hands and the weight of it sinking in. They weren't out yet, not by a long shot, but they were moving, and that was everything. Becoming everyday millionaires. It didn't happen overnight, and it didn't even happen in a year. But 5 years after the tear-stained moment at the kitchen table, 5 years of quiet mornings, steady payments, learning, trying, failing, sometimes but getting back up again, Delilah and Rhett were debt-free. No car loans, no credit card, just their modest mortgage, which was shrinking faster every month. They had one good, sturdy family car bought in cash. The same old duplex, now with a new fence and a fresh coat of paint. Not a mansion and not Instagram perfect, but theirs. And their marriage? It didn't just survive the journey, it deepened, stronger now because they dreamed together, planned together, sacrificed together. Money was the unspoken ache between them. It had become a huge bridge instead of a wall. Ron still came into the cafe some mornings, now leaning a little heavier on his cane, but grinning just as wide. One slow Tuesday, he sipped his coffee and said, You know, kiddo, you're well on your way to becoming an everyday millionaire. Delilah laughed, thinking he was teasing, but Ron shook his head seriously. You don't have to be a genius, he said. You don't have to be born rich. You just have to be steady. Time and compound interest do the heavy lifting. And then Delilah sat down later that night, running the numbers with Rhett, factoring in their retirement accounts, their growing savings, their investments, and she realized he wasn't joking. They weren't flashy, they didn't look rich, they still packed lunches and compared flyers, but underneath their modest lives, wealth was growing quietly, sure and steady as the maple trees lining the village streets. The next big step. It was Ron, of course, who eventually introduced them to a husband and wife financial advisor team, Todd and Kathy, who had built their lives on the same values. Kathy, sharp, and motherly, taught Delilah how to maximize their RSPs every year without stretching their cash flow. Todd, patient and funny, showed Rhett how topping up a TFSA wasn't about being fancy, it was about building options. They helped them shift from saving to building, from fear into choice. And every step of the way, Delilah and Rhett made a promise to themselves: we will not change our values. And when their bank balance grew enough that buying a bigger, fancier house seemed possible, even easy, they looked at each other and said, no, this works. This feels like breathing. Let's just make what we have better. They put up a better fence, a real one this time, not the old sagging chain link that Rhett had patched for years. They updated the kitchen cabinets, planting pride and laughter in every new hinge and drawer. They turned the duplex into a true home, not a stepping stone to something better, but a reflection of who they had become. No burden, no regret, only gratitude. A new legacy. Money became just another topping at the kitchen table. No shame, no anger, just facts, choices, dreams. The girls grew up learning how to balance a budget before they even learned how to drive. They knew what a TFSA was before they even got their first paycheck. They watched their parents not just ask and talk about money, but live it differently. And when the girls asked where it all started, Delilah would smile and say, it started the day we stopped being afraid of numbers. It started the day we decided we were worth dreaming for. Final chapter for Ron. Ron made it to 100. True to form, he didn't go quietly. Even in the care home those last few years, he was still giving the nurses financial advice, teasing the new aides, sneaking honey treats to anyone who looked like they needed cheering up. Delilah visited him whenever she could, often bringing a fresh cup of coffee from the cafe, the same way she had years ago when their journey began. Even when his body grew frail, his spirit stayed bright, still full of old jokes and sage advice wrapped in a wink. And when he passed, the whole village seemed to pause. Farmers, retirees, school teachers, anyone who had ever sat at the counter and been handed a mug of coffee with a story poured alongside it. At Ron's funeral, Delilah wept openly, not just for the loss of a man, but for the gift he had given her, the seed he had planted when she didn't even know she had the soil worth planting in. Now, standing in the cafe she and Rhett both owned outright, the place where it all began, she looked around and saw the world Ron had helped her build. Her daughters behind the counter, laughing and teasing the regulars, paying their way through school without the crushing burden of debt. Her husband grinning as he fixed a sticky drawer in the kitchen, proud and steady. Her own hands steady too, holding not just cups of coffee, but a legacy. On a quiet morning, a few weeks after the funeral, Delilah hung a framed photo of Ron on the memory wall near the front window, right above where the stool is where he used to sit. Below it, she placed a brass simple plaque, and under it a handwritten note, her best careful script. You taught us that dreams don't belong to the lucky or the rich. They belong to the ones who show up, who stay steady, and who believe even when it's hard. Thank you for believing in me before I knew how to believe in myself. Your lessons live here in every cup poured, in every debt paid, in every dream dared. We love you, Ron. Some mornings, when the cafe was still quiet, Delilah would sit at the counter with a cup of coffee and look at Ron's pictures, the twinkle in his eye forever frozen, and she would smile, not because life was perfect, not because the road had been easy, but because somehow, through all the mess and the grief and the starting over, they had made it, and they were, just like Ron had promised, everyday millionaires. Rich not just in money, rich in wisdom, love, and freedom. The kind of wealth you can't lose when markets crash. The kind that gets handed down not in checks but in courage. And in the golden light of that little cafe with her family around her and the 100 quiet victories stitched into the walls, Delilah knew Ron was here in all the ways that mattered most. The end. If you've listened this far, thank you for joining me in this journey. I'd like to mention a few little truths. This story is fiction. Yet the heart of it is real, and some of it comes from the mornings I spent behind the counter in a small cafe in Belmont, Ontario, pouring coffee, listening, and learning. Ron was one of the ones who sat with me at 5 a.m. day after day, sharing stories, advice, and simple truths, and changed the way I thought about money and about life. He believed in the power of small steps and steady choices. I'm forever grateful for Ron, and I miss you. I miss the whole crew that gathered around that coffee counter, building something real one morning at a time. And if you like this story, I encourage you to like and share or subscribe just to help me keep me on my storytelling journey. I appreciate you all more than you know.